Hi everyone, welcome to week 9 of the policy process course, and the second week we're covering the Sum of Us by Heather McGee. We'll be talking about housing, unions, voting, and residential segregation this week. Okay, so I want to talk about the book Race for Profit by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, because McGee covers housing and the 2008 recession in Chapter 4, but I think it's worth understanding more of the racial history of housing policy that led up to this era. And so I'm going to use the book Race for Profit as sort of a guide through that time period. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. This was part of the civil rights movement, but enforcement was uneven, and even within the law, discrimination persisted. So one of the things that Taylor points out is that even though we have, this idea that we're going to ignore race now, neighborhood conditions were determined by race, and neighborhood conditions are now used to determine who can get loans and how neighborhoods are treated. So you're saying you can't discriminate on race, but you can discriminate on things that were directly caused by race. So you get this cycle where racism caused the conditions, and then you're still allowed to discriminate on the conditions, and so functionally you are still discriminating on race. You just have to pretend you're discriminating on an effect of racism rather than on race directly. And she goes strong on this in saying that just as the federal government was trying to get rid of separate but equal in education, the Federal Housing Act really did propose essentially instituting the same system for housing. The idea was that you would not force integration in housing the way that integration was required in schools. And this was a big debate within the time period, and even a little bit within the Nixon administration. So George Romney was the first Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and if you recognize the name, George Romney is in fact the father of Mitt Romney. He was a governor of Michigan and also HUD Secretary in the Nixon administration. He said, "We've got to put an end to the idea of moving to suburban areas and living only among people of the same economic and social class. Black people have got to get to know white people, and white people have to know black people in this country. Otherwise, there will be no country." So this is a really strong position against white flight. At the time, you have a number of white families that are concerned that as schools are integrating, their children are going to be forced to go to school with black children, and therefore they move to areas without black children so that they can move out to schools, either in the suburbs, or if we were through the education lens, this was also a time of increase in private school enrollment. But we're looking at the residential segregation lens right now. And so one of the effects here was, this moving out to the suburbs that has come to be known as white flight. Now, much of the policy in this era is actually for the benefit of builders and lenders, not housing residents. So the Nixon administration tried to paint segregation as a matter of individual choices to distance themselves from any policy that could be construed as forced integration. Note that Romney was technically part of the Nixon administration, but Nixon complained vehemently that he could not get Romney to shut up. This was very much not the position of Nixon. He just wanted people to be satisfied. Nixon has a bit of a weird record on domestic policy, and for what it's worth, I think it's best understood as Nixon really cared about foreign policy, and he used domestic policy just to try to get reelected. So Nixon was very flexible in this, but he was not principled. So if residential segregation was popular and would get him reelected, then Nixon was for residential segregation. And certainly an idea that was as unpopular as attempting to use housing policy for goals of racial equality and racial justice. And remember in the 60s, this was extremely unpopular. Nixon was going to be against it. One of the things we talked about the submerged state previously in terms of individuals, particularly upper middle class and wealthy individuals, don't recognize the benefits that they are receiving from government. Way back then, Romney made the important observation that the affluent had benefited from public tax dollars in their housing, and the poor and low income should have the same right. He argued that the people who have benefited by national housing policy in the main are not even aware that they have had any help from public sources, and thus they tend to resent the idea that their tax money is being used to help the minority groups to meet their housing needs. The US spends 4 to 5 times as much money on the mortgage interest deduction as it does on anti-poverty housing policies like Section 8 housing. So like the majority of all of the money dedicated to housing is already going to upper middle and wealthy families. But because that money is functionally invisible and people are not aware of it, the spending on housing that is unpopular is the spending on anti-poverty programs. One of the other things I really liked about the book Race for Profit is that it pointed out the risk of home ownership. We tend to associate home ownership with wealth building, and while there are reasons, especially within the current system, why owning a home can lead to greater wealth building, it is inherently risky if you're not already wealthy or at a stable level of wealth because of the cost of repairs and the mortgage. If you can't repair the home or you can't meet your mortgage, there are risks of losing it and winding up even more indebted and less wealthy than you were to begin with. So a lot of homes were sold in substandard condition and needed substantial repair work, and federal mortgage insurance was for the benefit of the lender, not the homeowner. In other words, they were protecting the lender from making loans on, say, substandard properties or properties in bad need of repair. So the lender would come out okay, but the homeowner would not. And this means, like, unless you as the homeowner were able to do your own due diligence and had the set of skills to, like, not need, a home inspection or not need any of that other stuff, you were at risk of being pushed into a home that you did not realize was in the shape it was, because the lender was going to give you the loan. They were going to be okay. They had federal mortgage insurance. It was you, the homeowner, who was going to be out of luck if the home turned out not to be as good as advertised. Okay, so continuing that theme, home ownership, just not necessarily a good anti-poverty program. You're taking on large debts for an old and declining property. It's tied to a neighborhood with poor jobs prospects, and linking housing and wealth building creates economic problems. So one of the problems here is that rising house prices benefit established homeowners. So to the extent that they can benefit by restricting the supply of homes in their areas, they will. And they do this largely through zoning laws. Major sources of opposition to zoning for affordable housing are in fact established homeowners who are worried about the price of their home. And this is because we've linked housing and wealth building to the point where for many families, the majority of their wealth is in their house. Not only is this risky just because it's not diversified, but it also creates this terrible perverse incentive. We would be much better off if more wealth was located not in housing, but in bonds and stocks and other sorts of diversified resources, so that individuals didn't have this incentive to prop up the prices of housing as much as possible, because housing is of course a necessity for people, right? Like, it is bad for the price of housing to get too high. But the only way for the price of housing and individuals who own wealth to increase their wealth, if all of their wealth is in houses, is for the price of housing to go up. And so this is a terrible, conflict between like affordable housing and people who want to build wealth by owning homes or even speculating on homes. So again, this is a huge tension. It's not often talked about because from an individual perspective, sure, it probably makes sense to go and buy a house, assuming you have like the necessary level of initial wealth and initial resources to know that you'll be able to maintain the house and meet the obligations of the mortgage. And assuming you don't spend so much that your wealth is entirely undiversified. It makes sense relative to renting. But there's still this huge problem of we've created a whole group of people that has a direct economic incentive to oppose affordable housing. And I'm going to talk about this a little more when we talk about our fourth book, because I am going to go into some of the questions around poverty and zoning laws, which sound boring but are extremely relevant to this topic of affordable housing. So very notably, a lot of these homes were substandard and there were not affordable repairs. And there was a judge who literally said that the program was so bad it could hardly have been done more effectively as an act of sabotage, right? So not exactly a ringing endorsement. Nixon rescinds funding because the program becomes unpopular. And this is the beginning of Section 8, which we still have today. Conservatives like Section 8. These are housing vouchers, so funding from the government to existing housing, because there's no government construction in the suburbs. Liberals like it because housing is immediately available because it already exists. You're not waiting for the government to build it. This did not really work out. Section 8 has a years-long wait time, but that was the idea at the time. Speaking of perverse incentives, real estate profits were and are maximized by residential segregation. So reinforcing the segregated status quo absolutely is what maximizes profits for real estate. If realtors actively attempt to integrate or even passively push towards integration, the values of homes will, in general, in some cases, go down for them. The amount they can sell those homes for will go down. And since their money and income is based on a percentage of the homes that they are selling and they are working on, you now again have this economic incentive for realtors to at least passively oppose integration and not actively push for it, but possibly also to actively continue with segregation. In fact, they are incentivized to actively continue with segregation in choosing which homes they show to which person. The value of a home will vary based on the race of the person who owns it. Still today, black families have been advised and do often practice this, not being home when their house is being shown, making sure that they're out of there, but also not being home is fairly standard. So many people do that, but the extra is like hiding any family pictures. Essentially getting rid of any sign that the home is owned by a family of color, because they know that they will get fewer offers and lower offers if that fact is known. So, this still goes on today. And just to be like concrete about this, it's difficult to do the home by home, but Brookings looked and found that like home values in neighborhoods that are at least 50% black residents are valued approximately half the price of homes in neighborhoods with no black people. And note that this is after accounting for things like how many bedrooms and bathrooms and square feet and so forth are in the house. Right? So this is, like a huge cost of racial discrimination. Perhaps even more perversely, these houses are assessed higher on property taxes. So like the value that your home is assessed for a property tax is only loosely related to the value that it actually would sell for on the market. And black homeowners are discriminated against and hurt both ways by being overassessed so that they are taxed more, and undervalued on the actual market so that they make less money from selling their homes. And so one of the points the book makes is the regular promotion of homeownership as a means to overcome poverty or as a method of building wealth in our society has been built on a mistaken assumption that all people enter the housing market on an equal basis, or that the housing market itself is a neutral arbiter of value. Okay, going to move on to unions. The point I really want to emphasize out of this, and McGee makes several fantastic points, but there's no neutral way to have a market. You could think of the rules of a market as a sort of pre-distribution of resources. Like we talk about redistribution and inequality all the time, taxes and transfers. You can tax the wealthy, it provides benefits to the middle class and poor. But the rules of the market also determine what that initial distribution of income is. So like unions are a very salient example here, since that's the theme of this chapter. If you have rules that allow or encourage unions, you reduce inequality. An example that comes up less frequently, intellectual property rules and copyrights don't get discussed as much. We take them as background facts, but they're choices we make. So maybe you think instead of a 20-year copyright, it should be 5 or 50. And maybe these things are justified by increased innovation incentives, and maybe they aren't. This is an empirical economics question, or at least how much they have to do with innovation is an empirical question. Justified, you'd have to include both like the empirical side and the value side. But they're choices about market structure. We could make copyright longer or shorter. We could change intellectual property rules. We could, try to understand what impacts all of those things would have both on innovation and equality. Is there a trade-off there? Is there no trade-off there? What's the size of the trade-off? Which one do we want, right? These are all rules about markets that we can choose. We think sometimes of like the state and the market as being these two competing forces that are just both there and in conflict sometimes. But the reality is like both of these are created by people and by societies making choices. And in particular, states regulate markets. Like things like standardizing weights, measures, and currency was one of the first functions, because you can't really conduct effective trade if you don't trust that you have some common currency to trade. that will continue to be valuable into the future, and that when you're buying something that is 10 kilograms, it is actually like 10 kilograms. If you go to buy 10 kilograms of grain, you want it to be that amount of grain, and you want this to be standard. Also, writing down contracts and property rights and so forth. You can't really have a system of like home ownership without some sort of enforcement or a system of any sort of trade, right? But like the thing that makes someone own their home is not that they occupy it, it's that somewhere in a clerk's office there's paper that says they own it, and if it were ever disputed, they could go and point to that piece of paper, and they would have the state on their side saying, hey, whoever is trying to, take their home or for whatever reason this dispute occurred, they could say, no, the home is actually my property. Okay, voting rights. I have less to say other than to point out that we do have an expert at the University of Kentucky in the law school, Joshua Douglas. He wrote a book, Vote for Us. I've also linked in the speaker notes a presentation or an interview he did with Kentucky Educational Television. He's made a lot of good points around voting, voter ID laws. He helped shape Kentucky's voter ID law, which is one of the least stringent in the U.S. His view on this is that voter ID laws are not particularly necessary because there's not much fraud, but if we are going to have them, let's at least have some that are reasonably good and don't infringe on the right to vote. Again, you could look at some of his op-eds as well if you wanted to. But yeah, voting rights, very important, very in the news the past decade. Okay, I also want to talk about residential segregation. This is a map of Louisville and specifically of redlining. And I want to go to the interactive version of this map. So there was a project done by a local researcher in Louisville, and these sort of redlining maps exist in cities throughout the country. But this is a fairly well done map that shows, first of all, this is historically what bank maps looked like in 1937. And the idea was you could get loans in areas that were green or blue. Areas that were yellow were a little questionable, and areas that are red, you would not get a loan. And sorry, by questionable, I don't mean like the area itself was questionable. I meant like whether or not you could get a loan would, be a bit unsure. It might be on a more case-by-case basis, but certainly it would be harder to get a loan in an area that was yellow than it would be in one that was green or blue. Okay, and you can actually look at the PDFs from when this came out, and they're pretty explicit about why. Clarifying remarks. This area known as Little Africa, no paved streets, low type of inhabitants, right? So like this is pretty much just open racism because it's the 1930s, saying it's 100% African American. Talks about how much of the land is built up and the types of housing, and you could go through and look at other areas as well. One of the things I also like about this map is it shows how this still impacts us today. So give a minute for this map to load. But this is the redlining map again, and you can scroll over and see where mortgage lending is still being denied. And you can pretty visually see a correlation, which if you're familiar with the west end of Louisville will not be at all surprising to you, that it is still much harder to get a mortgage loan on the west side of Louisville. You can also compare like vacant properties, race, poverty, income. There's also a timeline, which again, certainly if like you are from Louisville, and I think a few of the people in this class are, it's worth looking to know the history. But also, I haven't seen histories like this for other cities, although I'd be less aware of them because I am a resident of Louisville. I've lived here for the past like 12 years or so. But you can see pretty explicitly like when there were restrictive covenants that forbid people from selling their houses to Black people in order to keep neighborhoods segregated, and a lot of very explicit racism. One thing I'll also point out, like the Interstate Highway Act, why are interstates where they are right now is a question that sometimes comes up. And the answer is like during that time period, they were often built to cordon off black neighborhoods or through the middle of black neighborhoods. Wealthy white neighborhoods had the political power to not have interstates built through the middle of them, and so they didn't. Black neighborhoods did not have the political power to prevent that, and so interstate builders and planners in the 50s built interstates through them. So, like, Pete Buttigieg made some headlines, I think, by earlier in the Biden administration by saying, like, our physical infrastructure has racial history, racial roots. This is essentially accurate, right? Like, the way that urban development has proceeded from the location of things like our interstates to how housing currently is explicitly rooted implicitly, I suppose, rooted in very openly racist decisions that were made in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And then these created systems that were able to perpetuate themselves forward in time. So, we didn't get here by accident or by like a bunch of individual choices. This was all a result of incentive structures that were set up by public policy. If we are going to reverse this, it will require a different set of incentive structures being set up by public policy. Okay, finally, we have our discussion questions. I will post these on Slack as usual. Discussion was a little lighter than in the past this week. Hopefully that will pick up again. I will remind you that these are graded. I like being able to hear from you, hear what you think about the reading that we're doing. So anyway, looking forward to hopefully a vibrant discussion about all of this, and hope you all have a good week.